You won't believe what happened the moment I set foot on my new property. Before I could even unpack a single box, a stranger stormed onto my lawn, yelling like she owned the place. She waved a clipboard like it was a weapon, screaming about rules I didn't even know existed, as if my own home was some shared community playground. Neighbors watched, frozen, while her army of paperwork-wielding enforcers circled me. Every word she spat dripped with entitlement. Every gesture screamed control. Moving in would be exciting and peaceful. Instead, it felt like stepping into a battlefield. When I first laid eyes on the house, it felt like a dream finally realized. Nestled at the edge of the lake, the property boasted a private pier that stretched into the shimmering water. The kind of place I had imagined countless summer evenings, quiet, peaceful, and entirely my own. My family and I had spent months hunting for a home that combined space, privacy, and a sense of community. We weren't looking for perfection. We were looking for a sanctuary where life could slow down, where mornings smelled like coffee on the deck. Evenings melted into the golden reflections of sunset on the water. The neighborhood had that small-town charm that city dwellers secretly crave. Tree-lined streets, friendly waves from neighbors, and a rhythm that hinted at decades of established routines. I imagined barbecues with the neighbors, casual chats on weekend mornings, and quiet walks along the water. The HOA, from what I had glimpsed online, seemed standard. Rules about lawn care, parking, and minor aesthetic requirements. Nothing that would interfere with life's simple pleasures. The reviews were mainly neutral, with some praising the order it brought and others complaining about occasional nitpicking. But I brushed those off as the usual mix you find in any community. Unpacking. The moving truck, my excitement bubbled over. Boxes lined the driveway, a maze of belongings awaiting their place. My kids ran ahead, eager to explore, their laughter echoing through the quiet streets. I could already see summer evenings stretching lazily before us, a life of calm routines, punctuated by the occasional friendly nod from a neighbor. I had imagined all this for months, maybe years. And finally, it was real. But there was a subtle undercurrent, something I couldn't quite name at first. The neighbors I passed on my first walk seemed watchful, not hostile, but attentive, as though measuring a newcomer against some invisible standard. A few houses away, a woman stood on her porch, her eyes tracking every movement I made. She smiled politely, but it was a measured, calculated smile that didn't reach her eyes. Something about her stance, the way she held herself with authority, suggested she knew the rules better than anyone and maybe enforced them herself. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, every neighborhood has its own personalities. The vigilant gardener, the retired professional with too much time on their hands, and the friendly but particular neighbor who notices every detail. Still, a subtle tension hung in the air, a whisper that beneath the calm streets and manicured lawns, someone or something watched. Little did I know that quiet undercurrent would surge into a wave of confrontation, testing not only my patience, but my right to enjoy the property I had worked so hard to call my own. By the second week, as boxes found their places and the pier glistened in the morning sun, I began to sense that my peaceful retreat might not remain untouched. Minor comments from passing neighbors hinted at community rules, casual mentions of shared access, and half smiles that seemed loaded with warning. I laughed it off, thinking it was small-town quirks and harmless chatter. But beneath those, smiles lay a different kind of energy, one that thrived on control, on asserting dominance over territory, and on bending rules to fit personal agendas. And it was only a matter of time before that energy found me, standing in the middle of my lawn, blindsided by someone who thought they had the right to dictate how I could or couldn't enjoy my own home. The calm, idyllic life I had envisioned teetered on the edge of chaos, with the first storm clouds forming quietly but ominously on the horizon. I had moved into a dream, but I was about to discover the nightmare that came with it. At first, the interference seemed minor, little nudges that I could brush off as standard neighborhood oversight. A polite note tucked under the door. Your landscaping exceeds HOA-approved heights. A casual comment from the neighbor across. The street about shared dock hours. I assumed these were minor hiccups, misunderstandings that could be easily resolved with an explanation. But over the next few days, the nudges evolved into full-blown intrusions, and it quickly became impossible to ignore the growing hostility from the HOA and particular neighbors. The first real confrontation happened on a bright Saturday morning. I had stepped onto the pier to check the docking lines, ensuring my boat was secure. That's when she appeared, the same woman who had silently observed me during my first walk through the neighborhood. She marched down the path with her clipboard, army in tow, her face set and her expression severe. Before I could say anything, she barked, "You can't just use that dock whenever you please. There are rules about access and scheduling, and you clearly haven't read them." Her tone was accusatory, sharp, and entirely devoid of politeness. I blinked, confused. I had purchased the property with full legal rights to that pier. Yet here, she was claiming authority over something I owned outright. The notes, regulations, and guidelines she cited were a tangled web of vague phrases, loopholes, and references to past amendments that were difficult to locate. She demanded proof of my ownership, questioned the legality of my boat, and implied that community tradition somehow outweighed formal deeds. Every statement dripped with entitlement. Watching her, I felt a mix of disbelief and rising anger. How could someone with no official power intimidate me over my own property? Over the next week, the harassment escalated. Anonymous letters appeared in the mailbox, typed, impersonal, each demanding compliance with rules that seemed invented on the spot. One insisted that all watercraft be registered with the HOA, even though the only formal regulation on boating in the neighborhood was state law, which I had already followed. Another threatened fines for improper pier maintenance, citing vague standards that didn't exist in any official document I could find. Every interaction with the HOA secretary, every phone call, seemed designed to frustrate me, delay responses, and wear me down psychologically. Neighbors began whispering too, some friendly but clearly anxious about my presence, others openly hostile, delivering thinly veiled warnings about the consequences of defiance. I noticed cars lingering near my driveway at odd hours, strangers lingering by the dock, and unsolicited inspections from people claiming to be community safety officers. Even my own children started asking why someone kept watching us, why a lady with papers seemed to appear whenever we stepped outside. The tension became palpable, transforming the dream of waterfront living into a gauntlet of anxiety and suspicion. I tried reason at first, sending emails, making polite phone calls, and writing formal letters. I provided copies of my property, deed, state registration for the pier, and documentation proving that every complaint they lodged was baseless. The HOA acknowledged receipt but continued to escalate, ignoring facts and twisting interpretations of obscure rules to fit their narrative. Each reply was met with a new demand: a survey, a notarized statement, a verification I had already supplied. Weeks passed, and the bureaucracy became a weapon, each layer of paperwork designed to frustrate, exhaust, and intimidate. The emotional toll was heavy. I couldn't relax on the pier without fear that another confrontation would erupt. My family avoided the front yard, worried about running into the same woman or her entourage. Friends visiting for weekends hesitated to speak too loudly, to dock, boats, or even to enjoy the deck, sensing the invisible weight of scrutiny. The psychological warfare was constant: endless paperwork, passive-aggressive neighbors, and unannounced inspections. Each day, the stress compounded, turning excitement into dread. Then came the fines. They arrived like clockwork. Small amounts at first, then increasingly larger, all justified under the same ambiguous clauses. I received notices for obstruction of common space, failure to maintain aesthetic uniformity, and even unsanctioned recreational activity, each accompanied by a stern warning of penalties and escalating consequences. The amounts weren't financially devastating, but the principle mattered. I had purchased this property to live freely, to enjoy my family, to experience peace, not to be manipulated and intimidated by self-appointed regulators who had no legal standing. The next turning point was the neighbor meeting, a gathering. That felt like a tribunal. Invitations had been slipped under the door, urging attendants to resolve compliance issues. I had expected a civil discussion, maybe a compromise. What I found was a courtroom-style spectacle. The same woman presiding, her clipboard serving as a gavel, neighbors seated as jury members and me cast as the accused. Every accusation was rehearsed, every argument rehearsed to intimidate. Questions came rapidly, each framed to make me defensive, each implying guilt where none existed. The fear of escalation was suffocating, and yet I couldn't back down. Walking out in defeat wasn't an option. My property, my rights, and my family's peace were at stake. Emails and letters began to multiply at an alarming rate. Every violation demanded immediate response, with deadlines set for impossible turnaround times. One particularly absurd claim accused me of disturbing community visual harmony by placing a simple outdoor chair on my deck. Another insisted I remove my children's small sailboat because it exceeded visual guidelines for watercraft aesthetics. It felt like a relentless test of patience and sanity. Each interaction left me more determined to fight, yet more drained emotionally, in a constant tug-of-war between perseverance and frustration. In the midst of this, I discovered inconsistencies in the HOA's own records. Some rules cited in letters didn't exist in archived documents. Dates didn't match, amendments were misrepresented, and official policies were often cited inaccurately. It became increasingly clear that their goal wasn't compliance or community. Safety, it was control, intimidation, and proving dominance over a newcomer they perceived as a threat. This realization fueled my determination, but also stoked anger that simmered beneath the surface, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. A particularly nerve-wracking week involved a series of unannounced inspections on 3 separate mornings. Different HOA representatives arrived without warning, scrutinizing every inch of my property. One measured the distance between my deck and the shoreline with a tape measure. Another questioned the type of wood used on the pier. Each encounter ended with veiled threats of fines and implications of legal action. My family watched, helpless, as our sanctuary transformed into a minefield, each step potentially triggering conflict. The turning point came when I realized that the fight wasn't just about the pier, the fines, or the paperwork. It was about power. This HOA, fueled by a sense of entitlement and reinforced by neighbors eager to assert their own influence, sought to control what they did not own. They treated rules as weapons, wielding them selectively, and leveraged community gossip to isolate me socially. Every interaction was designed to erode my confidence, making me question my own understanding of rights and responsibilities. But instead of breaking me, it ignited a resolve I didn't know I possessed. At night, I would sit on my porch, staring at the water and planning. How could I navigate this maze of petty rules, harassment, and intimidation? Which allies existed, and which neighbors were complicit in reinforcing the HOA's overreach? Each day required meticulous documentation, including photographs, emails, letters, and witness accounts. I knew the fight ahead would demand strategy, patience, and courage beyond what I had imagined when I first moved in. By the end of the 3rd month, the escalation had become a spectacle. Neighbors began taking sides openly. Some offered quiet support, discreetly expressing frustration at the overreach. Others doubled down on hostility, whispering warnings, spreading rumors, and attempting to pressure me into concessions. Every interaction became a chess move, measured, calculated, with consequences for a misstep that could trigger further conflict or fines. The pier, once a symbol of freedom and joy, now represented a battleground. In this place, personal rights collided with neighborhood politics. And just when I thought the situation had reached its peak, a new twist emerged. A letter arrived, not from the HOA, but from an outside attorney, citing previous infractions and threatening legal action unless I complied immediately. The document referenced rules I had never seen and demanded actions that, if ignored, could result in substantial penalties. The shock hit hard. The minor annoyances had transformed into a full-scale campaign to control, intimidate, and, potentially, financially, punish me. The tension reached a fever pitch. Every decision, every move, felt loaded with consequences I couldn't predict. I spent the following days immersed in research, calling legal advisors, cross-referencing HOA documents, and preparing for what felt like an inevitable showdown. The frustration was overwhelming, but so was the determination. Each unfair notice, each baseless fine, each whispered threat fueled a growing strategy. I would not be bullied out of my property, nor would I allow rules to be twisted arbitrarily to exert power over my family and me. And yet the question lingered, sharp and unrelenting. How far would they go? How much harassment would it take before someone finally acted on their threats? Every knock on the door, every glance from a neighbor, every rustle of papers in the mailbox became a countdown to the moment when confrontation could no longer be avoided. The rising tension was almost unbearable, but it set the stage for what would become the most intense confrontation I had ever faced. One that would test not only my rights as a homeowner, but my patience, resilience, and sense of justice. The day of reckoning arrived on an unexpectedly bright morning, the kind that seemed almost cruel in its calm. I had spent countless sleepless nights preparing, collecting evidence, and mapping out a strategy to confront the relentless barrage of intimidation and fines. Every unfair notice, every unannounced inspection, every whispered threat from neighbors had built toward this moment. I could feel the tension vibrating through the air as I stepped out onto the lawn, the pier glinting in the morning sun like a trophy I refused to relinquish. It began with the familiar sound of approaching footsteps, measured, purposeful. She appeared first, clipboard in hand, flanked by two neighbors whose faces were etched with smug satisfaction. Their presence alone carried the weight of authority, an unspoken declaration that I had crossed the invisible line of what they considered acceptable. I met her gaze and, for the first time, refused to look away. Her eyes narrowed, scanning me as though measuring my resolve, testing whether the months of harassment had left me broken, submissive. "Have you received the latest notice?" she demanded, voice sharp and commanding. "You violate community guidelines. Immediate compliance is required." I held up the stack of documents I had spent weeks compiling: deeds, official correspondence, photographs, emails, and legal references meticulously arranged to expose the contradictions in every claim they had made. My voice was steady, calm, and firm as I spoke. "I've reviewed every rule, every claim, every notice. None of this applies to me. This pier, this property, every inch of this land is mine, and your authority ends where the law begins." A murmur rippled through the small gathering of neighbors who had congregated, some out of curiosity, others eager to witness my humiliation. She blinked, momentarily stunned, clearly unaccustomed to defiance. Her following words were rapid-fire accusations, references to obscure bylaws, and threats of escalating fines. Every statement was an attempt to overwhelm, to intimidate, to assert dominance through volume and aggression rather than substance. I listened carefully, letting each claim land, knowing that my counter-arguments would need precision, clarity, and undeniable evidence to be effective. As she spoke, I methodically presented the documents, pointing out inconsistencies, citing state laws and referencing past HOA resolutions that directly contradicted her claims. Each rebuttal was met with a flicker of disbelief in her eyes. I could see the tension growing among her entourage as the narrative they had rehearsed unraveled before them. The carefully constructed facade of control began to crumble. Then came the bombshell. One of the neighbors, who had been previously silent, stepped forward, holding a recording device. "I recorded several meetings," he said, voice trembling but resolute. "Every time the HOA made these claims, internal conversations were admitting some rules are selective." He handed over the device. The playback revealed members whispering about targeting newcomers, bending rules for personal gain, and creating examples of residents who dared to assert their rights. Shock and murmurs spread through the crowd. The sense of invincibility the HOA had relied upon began to falter. The woman with the clipboard attempted to regain control, her voice rising in panic as she accused me of illegal recordings and harassment. But her authority had been undermined. Her power, always reliant on intimidation, now faced tangible proof of manipulation and bad faith. I pressed further, calmly detailing the financial, emotional, and legal implications of their actions, highlighting the absurdity of fines, fabricated violations, and selective enforcement. Every word hit its mark, resonating not only with the small audience of neighbors, but with the invisible weight of justice itself. It was then that she completely lost her composure. Clipboard shaking, face flushed, she shouted over me, trying to reassert dominance through sheer volume. But the community, once passive observers, began murmuring agreement with my points, questioning her authority, and openly criticizing the escalation. The dynamic shifted. Where once I had stood as a solitary defender, I now saw the cracks forming in the facade of power, cracks wide enough to drive a wedge between her and the neighborhood she had attempted to control. The next move was decisive. I called in the legal advisor I had retained, who had been observing discreetly in the background. Their presence alone added weight, authority, and credibility to my claims. In clear, formal language, they articulated the legal boundaries, referencing property law, HOA statutes, and specific cases where overreach had been successfully challenged. The effect was immediate. The woman faltered, her threats losing their bite, her posture stiffening under the undeniable authority of the law. Then came the most satisfying moment. I asked her directly, voice steady, "Do you understand that your demands have no legal standing? That any attempt to enforce them could result in financial and legal consequences for you personally?" The silence was palpable and heavy as she struggled to respond. For the first time, she was not in control. She was reactive, defensive, exposed. The clipboard that had symbolized power now seemed absurdly small in her trembling hands. Neighbors leaned in, some whispering apologies, others nodding quietly, acknowledging the injustice they had witnessed. The tension, which had thickened, the air for months began to dissipate, replaced by a mixture of awe, relief, and vindication. The psychological weight of months of harassment lifted slightly, though the sting of what had transpired remained. I realized in that moment that the fight was far from over, but the balance had shifted. The scales of intimidation had been disrupted, and I had emerged not only unbroken, but empowered. Yet the climax was not just in the legal or procedural victory. It was the emotional release, the cathartic validation that months of patience, meticulous preparation, and unwavering resolve had finally converged into a decisive confrontation. The woman, once an imposing figure of control, now stood diminished, her authority revealed as a house of cards. The neighborhood, previously a theater of passive complicity, had, after the confrontation, a strange calm settled over the neighborhood. The intensity of the harassment had subsided, though it left a lingering tension, a quiet acknowledgement of the upheaval that had taken place. For the first time in months, I could walk through my yard without flinching at every movement or shadow. My children ran freely across the lawn, their laughter no longer punctuated by anxious glances toward the street. The pier, once a battleground, gleamed in the sunlight as a symbol of reclaimed peace, a place I could finally enjoy without fear. In the days following the showdown, the HOA sent tentative communications. Their tone had shifted, markedly less aggressive, peppered with cautious language that acknowledged the need to operate within legal boundaries. The fines were rescinded, and vague allegations were quietly withdrawn. Several board members requested private meetings to clarify procedures and ensure future compliance. Though their authority remained in theory, their leverage had evaporated in the face of evidence, preparation, and the clear demonstration of resolve. I took this opportunity to strengthen my position further. Copies of all correspondence, photographs, and records of interactions were meticulously organized in both digital and physical formats. I also sought professional advice on updating my property management practices and neighborhood interactions to prevent similar escalations in the future. The lessons learned were harsh, but invaluable. Knowledge of property rights, careful documentation, and measured communication are not just tools. They are armor in communities where rules can be weaponized. The neighbors' reactions were mixed. Some approached with newfound respect, offering congratulations on navigating the ordeal with composure and firmness. Others remained distant, perhaps cautious of entanglement or unwilling to revisit the controversy. A few, emboldened by the exposure of the HOA's tactics, began asking questions, challenging minor rules, and advocating for more transparent, fairer community governance. Slowly, the neighborhood began to shift, not in complete harmony, but in a direction where transparency and fairness were more openly valued. The woman with the clipboard largely retreated, her presence noticeably reduced. While some lingering attempts at passive-aggressive commentary occurred, they lacked the force and organization of previous efforts. Her authority had been publicly undermined, and the community had witnessed her overreach firsthand. It was a subtle but powerful reminder of how accountability, evidence, and perseverance can dismantle intimidation that relies on fear rather than legitimacy. My family adjusted to the new rhythm of life, reclaiming the routines and pleasures that had initially drawn us to the property. Summer evenings on the pier returned to their intended serenity. Dinners accompanied by the gentle lapping of water, morning coffee watched over by birds, and sunlight reflecting off the lake, weekends, filled with boating, swimming, and laughter. The property, once a stage for conflict, became a sanctuary once more, reinforcing why we had moved here in the first place. The legal and practical lessons remained etched in our daily lives. Every interaction with the HOA was now approached with caution, documentation, and clarity. I attended meetings not with fear, but with preparedness, fully aware of both my rights and the limits of HOA authority. The experience reshaped my understanding of community living, that rules, no matter how minor they seem, can be wielded unjustly if unchecked, and that standing firm requires patience, diligence, and strategic thinking. In a broader sense, the experience transformed my perception of neighbors and community dynamics. Trust, once assumed, became something earned and maintained through observation and interaction. Friendships were evaluated more critically, alliances recognized more carefully, and interactions filtered through the lens of experience. Yet, there was also a deepened appreciation for those who acted with integrity, support, and fairness, revealing the actual value of community when contrasted against the manipulative tactics we had endured. Beyond the immediate property and neighborhood, the ordeal instilled a profound sense of empowerment. Knowing the extent to which preparation, evidence, and calm assertiveness can influence outcomes provided a lasting confidence. It was a lesson, not just in property rights, but in human behavior, negotiation, and the power of standing resolutely for what is legally and morally correct. Every encounter with the HOA, every unfair demand, had become a test of resilience, culminating in a victory that was as psychological as it was practical. Months passed, and the neighborhood slowly adjusted to the new reality. Meetings became more procedural, discussions more transparent, and attempts at arbitrary enforcement diminished. Even minor disputes, once fertile grounds for intimidation, were addressed with documentation, reason, and fairness. The community had learned through observation and consequence that coercion without basis could not sustain control. In this environment, property owners began to feel a renewed sense of security and agency, an intangible but vital result of the confrontation. The pier itself became more than a place of leisure. It was a symbol. Every plank represented perseverance, every nail a refusal to succumb to petty power plays. The sunlight reflecting off the water was no longer a backdrop to conflict, but a reminder that vigilance, clarity, and courage can restore order and protect what is rightfully yours. My children's laughter echoed across the water with a freedom that had been absent during the months of harassment. Every shared family moment became an affirmation of victory, not just over a local power struggle, but over fear, uncertainty, and manipulation. At the same time, the experience left an enduring wariness. While the immediate threat had subsided, the potential for future overreach remained. HOA boards change, personalities shift, and the temptation to assert power often persists. I remained vigilant, not out of paranoia, but out of a commitment to ensuring that neither my family nor our property would be subjected to arbitrary authority again. The vigilance was proactive, measured, and informed by months of firsthand experience navigating complex interpersonal and bureaucratic dynamics. Community relations gradually improved, though not universally. Those who had observed the confrontation became allies, offering support, insights, and shared vigilance. Informal networks emerged, neighbors looking out for one another, questioning arbitrary interpretations of rules, and fostering a culture of transparency. The conflict had inadvertently strengthened the sense of accountability within the neighborhood, even among those not directly involved. It was a silver lining. Adversity had catalyzed awareness, discussion, and ultimately led to improvement in governance. Reflecting on the ordeal, the personal growth became apparent. Frustration and fear had been transformed into strategy, anger into meticulous preparation, and intimidation into confidence. Each interaction had demanded patience, attention to detail, and calm assertiveness. The victory was not merely the absence of fines or the withdrawal of threats. It was the cultivation of resilience, resourcefulness, and an unwavering sense of justice. These lessons extended beyond property disputes. They were principles applicable to any situation where power, rules, and human behavior intersect. The ultimate takeaway was clear. Knowledge is power, preparation is armor, and resolve is transformative. No system, no matter how entrenched, is impervious to scrutiny when confronted with evidence, clarity, and the courage to act. Standing firm against injustice, whether bureaucratic, social, or interpersonal, can be exhausting. Still, it can also restore balance, protect rights, and catalyze change. The experience reinforced the importance of awareness, advocacy, and proactive engagement within one's community. In the quiet evenings that followed, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast golden reflections across the lake, I could finally appreciate the magnitude of what had been achieved. The pier, the house, the land, they were still ours, untouched by arbitrary power. The neighborhood, though forever marked by the confrontation, began to operate with a newfound respect for boundaries, rights, and fairness. My family had emerged stronger, more united, and wiser from the experience. And yet, the story left a lingering thought, one that I carry to this day. How many other homeowners quietly endure similar struggles, navigating rules and personalities that seek to assert control beyond what is lawful or fair? How often do intimidation and selective enforcement go unchallenged, shaping communities through fear rather than justice? The confrontation had provided answers for me, but it also raised questions about accountability, community dynamics, and the vigilance required to protect what is rightfully yours. Ultimately, the resolution was more than legal or procedural. It was deeply personal. It was a reclamation of autonomy, a victory over manipulation, and a testament to the power of steadfast determination. The impact extended beyond fines or rules. It reshaped perceptions, strengthened bonds, and set a precedent. For fairness and clarity, each day spent enjoying the pier, hosting family gatherings, or simply sitting in quiet reflection became a celebration of resilience and triumph. The final lesson, etched into every moment and memory, was unmistakable. Assert your rights, stand firm in the face of unwarranted intimidation, and never underestimate the power of preparation, evidence, and calm persistence. Communities may test you, rules may challenge you, and individuals may seek to dominate through fear. Still, with vigilance and resolve, justice can prevail. And as I look across the lake, the sunlight glinting off the water, I know this truth to be unshakable. The fight may be exhausting, but the victory, when earned, is profound, lasting, and transformative.